This is Pramod K. Nair of the Department of English, University of Hyderabad, and here we continue our lessons on posthumanism with one specific contextual topic for today as part of our third lesson, which will be the environment and the Anthropocene. Now, at first glance, clearly you might wonder what the connection is between something like environment or environmental disaster and the Anthropocene with posthumanism, which is a school of thought, as we have discussed, that looks primarily at the future of humans, the role of technology in human lives, and so on and so forth. But there is, as we shall see, a very close connection between environment, environmentalism, and the idea of the Anthropocene. Now, the point that I want to emphasize is that posthumanism as a school of thought arises at the turn of the 20th century, which is also the period of serious, if not severe, environmental crisis, which includes global warming, species death across multiple species, of course pollution, desertification, ozone layer depletion, and several others. It is the period of great industrial disasters and rising sea levels, among others. So what we need to keep in mind is that while posthumanism emerged through the extended debates in philosophy, in literary studies, discourse and cultural studies, wherein, as we have already noted in our early lessons, we have explored, as in posthumanism has explored the limits of humanism, but most importantly, as people have argued, what is the nature of humanism? What is the limit of humanism when we think in terms of planetary changes, planetary disaster, which is the mark of the Anthropocene? In other words, what we are aware of is that post-colonialism is a school of thought that may focus on human futures, but not exclusively on human futures, principally because its roots, its intellectual heritage has gathered its strength from an analysis of how humans have lived, how humans have intervened in the history of the earth, of the planet, in the history of various species. Which means to say that the posthumanist school of thought is inextricably linked to the consciousness that humans have altered the earth in multiple ways, perhaps irreversibly, and almost certainly not for the good. So there is a connection, like I said, and I would like to repeat, between environment, environmentalism or environmental thought, the concept of the Anthropocene, which is the notional age where or from when humans have intervened directly in the planet's history. Those of you who are people who follow the newspaper debates about this, the International Union of Stratigraphers has refused to accept this term as of last month, that is March 2023, in terms of its connotations and in terms of its applicability and validity. However, the point to be noted is the term has found cultural currency in literature, cultural discourse, philosophy, environmentalist studies and environmentalist activism, whether or not the scientific working group has accepted the concept or not. So this is a caveat that I would like to file. Now, let's go step by step in our study of the environmental crisis and posthumanism. So first, environmental crisis. Everybody talks about it. We all recognize it. It's almost a self-evident thing, although the exact nature of the crisis is not perhaps very visible. We do know that temperatures are rising. We do know that there is acute water shortage, that there is a dearth of rainfall, that there is a large number of species that disappear on a regular basis, as in birds, animals, plant species that die. So with the environmental crisis, attention was primarily focused on the human roots of the crisis, particularly what is called the sixth extinction, which means to say that the environmental crisis is not seen as a quote-unquote natural event. It is seen principally as triggered by human activity, human action, in a historical perspective, as in right from the time of the invention of agriculture, as some argue. Some argue that it is with colonization and plantation cultures, which will be with the discovery of the New World, slavery, etc. Others argue that this human intervention in the planet's history took place with the Industrial Revolution, the invention of steam. And some others believe it is primarily to do with the nuclear age, which is the 20th century. Be that as it may, the human roots of the crisis, which involves the exploitation of animals through humans' instrumental use of them, and the lack of attention to the duties of the human towards the non-human and the non-living. So there are three central core areas in which attention is being drawn: the human roots of the crisis, the exploitation of the non-human form, which would include animals and plants through an instrumental use of them, by which we mean that the non-human is treated as something that we can exploit, consume, destroy, because they are only something for us to utilize, for us to make use of, which is what is called an instrumental use of other life forms. Then, of course, there is the neglect of our duties, as in human duties, towards the non-human form and the environment. As the coinage made its first appearance from the scientists Paul Crutzen and Schwarzschild, it asks us to think about it like this, and I'm quoting here: imagine our descendants in the year 2200 or 2500. They might liken us to aliens who treated the earth as if it were a mere stopover for refueling, or even worse, characterize us as barbarians who would ransack their own home. Living up to the Anthropocene means building a culture that grows with Earth's biological wealth instead of depleting it. Remember, in this new era, nature is us. It's a very interesting and crucial quote, because it says, as you can see, that we need to build, as in humanity needs to build a culture that does not see the earth as something meant exclusively for exploitation, for utilization, like I said, the instrumental use, but where we grow with the world's culture, with the planetary culture, rather than just focus on utilization, maximum utilization, and so on and so forth. Because here we can no longer say that there is nature out there and then there is us. There is nature which is distinct from human culture. As the quote indicates, nature is us. We are nature. This is a very post-human thought, post-human idea, that we are embedded in nature. Nature is what we are. We are not distinct from nature. By we, it means humanity, human culture, human-made culture and cultural practices. So this is the Anthropocene in a nutshell. Now, Paul Crutzen coined the term Anthropocene to indicate that the previous period of the Holocene, as the geological time scale is referred to, has been followed by an age where the human impact on the planet has raced ahead, has accelerated. So it's not a question of human impact measured at the slow glacial pace of agriculture. With industrialization, things have accelerated. With digital technology, with steam, with the nuclear age, we have seen a progressive acceleration of the human impact on the planet, by which we mean human impact on the non-human, but as well as on the non-living, including rocks, soil, earth, water, etc. So Paul Crutzen's point is that the Anthropocene is a way of looking at a time scale over which humanity has impacted and impacted adversely on the planet. So the Anthropocene is a concept that, like I said before, has more or less emerged alongside the post-humanist school of thought, because the human impact on the planet, according to the post-humanists, has produced unequal life chances for different species. So it's not just a question of measuring impact on, say, fossil fuels and what we have done with fossil fuels. It's not enough to say that nuclear technology has done this, this and this to, say, several plants, several animals, several humans, of course. But a vision of human impact across the planet, which involves looking at, say, plastics, nuclear technology, species death, industrial disasters, and a whole gamut of human activities, human culture. So the Holocene followed by the Anthropocene is the sequence we have looked at. But for the post-humanists, who have consistently argued that you cannot separate the human from the non-human, the Anthropocene is a very workable concept. The Anthropocene intersects with post-humanist thinking in terms of human actions, and I have mentioned all of them just now. Agriculture, the enormous use of fossil fuels, accelerated use of fossil fuels, and multiple different forms of technology, including the nuclear and the genetic. But that is one aspect of it. But there are political and economic organizations, processes that have exploited the human, the non-human, and have organized the non-human and the human into various categories of people. Think of plantations, slavery, capitalism, colonialism. These are political and economic systems, political and economic structures or processes whereby humanity has undertaken to reorganize the planet, to reorganize the human, and to reorganize the non-human. Plantations, slavery, capitalism, and colonialism are modes of organizing all forms of life, but also forms of organizing the non-living, So post-humanists see the Anthropocene as marked by a very clear, a very radical dichotomy, where some forms of life are countable, are valuable, called bios, and several forms of life that don't count, that are just what Giorgio Agamben would call bare life. They are just bare life. So for the post-humanists, the Anthropocene gives us this dichotomy that there are forms of life that are hierarchically superior, that are visibly powerful, that are visibly technologically advanced, and as a result, they are in a position to exploit the other forms of life as well as the non-living form. All right. So that's why for the post-humanists, the Anthropocene is a very useful argument. Now, think about the fact that something like colonialism, which was built upon the exploitation of the land, the exploitation of the natural resources, and the exploitation of the people. These changes, these processes induced by colonialism altered the very condition in which several people lived, such as indigenous people. The indigenous people have adapted to change, of course. They have adapted to nature, yes. We are not glorifying the indigenous way of life. Please understand that. There's no romanticizing the indigenous way of life. But what is important to recognize is that the relationship with nature was slightly different. They have adapted to change. Colonialism made such drastic changes at such a quick pace that the indigenous people could not cope. So, as people have noted, from health problems to new diets, new language, and the erosion of the soil on which they have lived for generations, which means to say that indigenous people even now understand their vulnerability to climate change as the result of a history of colonially induced changes. which means to say that for many indigenous people, their contemporary vulnerability, their current vulnerability to climate change is a result of a history of, say, plantation cultures, capitalism and colonialism. So for most of these people, the question of ecological justice, as in I'm referring to the indigenous people, the question of ecological justice is linked to questions of social justice. You cannot speak of plantations, you cannot speak of agriculture in the New World, which was the term given to the United States of America from the 15th century, a moment of discovery and so on. You cannot talk about agriculture in the New World without talking about slavery. You cannot talk about slavery without talking about the organization of land into plantations. Like we cannot speak about the organization of land in colonialism without speaking about the racialized forms of labor. Okay, which is to say that our history, as in human history, involves specific socio-economic processes that have treated the land, the inhabitants, by which I mean both human and non-human, in particular exploitative ways. Okay, so that's why the concept of the Anthropocene has certain historical resonances for people such as the indigenous tribes of the world. Now, I want to move on to our sense of the planet. Our sense of the planet, our sense of our quote-unquote home, is never pure in that sense. Our sense of the planet stems from a very mediated, a very technologically mediated, visual, mapped, calculated simulation. This could include the geological surveys from the early 19th century. Some of you may know that the Trigonometrical Survey of India mapped the land for its physical features but also for its mineral resources. Then the Survey of India, the organization, was established in the mid-19th century to carry this out in a more methodical fashion. So geological surveys prepared maps. You even now see those maps. If you look at those maps, it will say at the foot, Survey of India. The maps are authoritative because they are produced and published by the Survey of India. Then you have Google Earth. And then you have, of course, the famous blue marble photograph. I do not know whether you have seen, it's worth taking a look at. The blue marble photograph is the first complete picture of the earth from outside the earth. It was taken from the, I would like you to take a look at this. It was taken so that you could grasp the entire, it was taken from a spacecraft and the entire planet was visible for us to see for the first time, which means to say our awareness of what the earth is stems from that kind of visualization. These are ways of seeing the planet. Maps, global shots like this of the planet, the globe itself, and then there are literary texts. So for posthumanists and environmentalists, these are mediated forms of viewing the planet. But for posthumanists and of course environmentalists who accept the argument from the Anthropocene specialists, argue that whenever we see the earth, whenever we present the earth, we present the human at the hierarchic top, that it's humanity which rules, it's humanity that dominates, that the planet belongs to us humans. We do not want to accept any other ownership. We do not concede any other form of ownership. So these mediated forms of viewing have focused on the human at the center of the world, at the top of the hierarchy. Now we know that posthumanists have asked for a rethink of the animal-human relations. For example, the nature park, the zoo park and the sanctuary. And opinion is divided about this, whether sanctuaries are places which offer space and opportunity for a certain kind of ethical responsibility towards the animals, and it is determined by a logic of interdependence. But others have also argued that the political commitment and the role of international organizations, trade associations and others are attempts to reconcile the commercial and ethical aspects of the wildlife sanctuary, which means to say that the wildlife sanctuary is not a politically neutral thing of just putting animals together and letting them live free lives. There's a very strong political, economic, social and ethical dimension to the question of the sanctuary, as I've just outlined for you. So I want to run through a small list here of how posthumanists address ecological issues. Posthumanists argue that we live in the age of biotech engineering, genetic engineering, and therefore we are in the age of the post-natural. The post-natural. By post-natural, we mean that we have learned how to modify, tamper with, tinker with nature. Now, in speculative fiction, in science fiction, we see the human, animal, and machine hybrids, which are now a reality. We have accepted that there is a potential loss of human control over the non-human and the non-living. And we think of genres like eco-horror or ecological horror, where humans are trapped in situations besieged by predator birds, predator animals, sharks, etc., etc. So it's an awareness that the human control over the non-human world is not as effective as we believed it was. The posthumanists also look at new visions of wilderness. We are very interested in acknowledging how we are embedded in abiotic and non-organic matter. For instance, the fact that we have bones. Bones come from calcium. Calcium comes to us from the earth, into which fossils of predecessor generations have gone. So the chemicals that make us living, alive, which is to say that what we think of as life, as animated matter, actually hinges upon inanimate matter, chemicals, which are not live organisms, but it is because of those live organisms that we are alive. We have an interest, a very strong interest, posthumanists have a very strong interest in deep time, which is about the time before humans as we now know it, the Homo sapiens, appeared on Earth, and therefore we have a very strong history in the evolution of life forms. How was it at the time of the Neanderthals? What kind of life did the hominids have? The cave art, which we know has survived over many millennia of evolution, capture a certain kind of life of the Neanderthals. But in sharp contrast to the interest in the ancient world, we also speculate on a world without humanity, which has to do with primarily seen in an thought experiment in Alan Weisman's book, The World Without Us. So what would it be like to have a world, to have a planet without humanity on it? And there are plenty of Last Man novels that we are aware of, starting with Mary Shelley's The Last Man. Then, of course, finally, we speculate on how human evolution may proceed in the future. Will we proceed the way we have proceeded now, or will there be an involvement and cohabitation with other life forms as well? We recognize technological interventions. We acknowledge also dehumanization, zombification in posthuman lives. We acknowledge that there are more than human and other than human forms of existence. But finally, we also then think in terms of human enhancements. Can we think in terms of humanity evolving in ways where we have enhanced certain features of ourselves, whether it's cognitive, intellectual, moral, or ethical? Can we be better and different humans precisely because we have enhanced ourselves? So, as you can see, in this wide-ranging session, we have looked at the link between ecology and posthumanist thought. Our posthumanists who are interested in the evolution of the human, the future of the human, and the impact of the human on the natural world. Thank you.